On behalf of the Friends of the Commons and the Academy, I'd like to welcome you to the Yachats Commons. Most of you look familiar. If there's a few new faces, facilities are as far into the hall. If you have one of these little devices, we'll ask that you turn it off or put it on vibrate so it doesn't interrupt. We have a donation jar on the table there. We also have a sign-up list for future events. Coming up on July 4th is our La Di Da Parade. The Academy isn't sponsoring that, but it's quite an event here in town. And we have a special guest this year, James Roddy, will be here in his clown outfit with his elephant. And the elephant says, "Follow me," or "Head for the hills," something like that. James Roddy will be our speaker on July 5th, and he will be talking about the ancient myths and traditions from Native American people regarding tsunamis and earthquakes from way back. And the significance of the elephant is when they had the last tsunami in Indonesia, all the animals were up in the hills. None of them perished. So the idea is if your cat, dog, cow, horse starts going to high ground, follow them, because this is even before the tsunami. Also, July 15th, 9 a.m., meet in this parking lot, Kim Nelson. This, again, is not a Academy event, but we're helping to promote it. We'll be doing a bird walk out in the forest. She's here to do the annual Murrelet bird count, which happens the day before. They get up real early in the morning, head down to 10 Mile and various places and scout the Murrelets as they're coming back into the old growth forest. So tonight is the third of a three-part program we've had celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publishing of To Kill a Mockingbird. This book has had quite an impact on several generations that have been able to read it. The first program we had was the original film version. The second program, Prue took excerpts from the actual book. Some of our actors and actresses read those parts, and then we had group discussions, which was audio taped. Tonight's is the third of the three-part series. We sent a copy of the discussion to Dr. Campbell, just for his review, and if it was audible, I'm sure he will comment on it. I don't know. That was an interesting discussion. What you see on the wall are the major issues that group decided they wanted to discuss in smaller groups. So they broke into smaller groups, discussed these particular issues. The racism group had the largest number of people in it, with the most young people, and refused to come back into the major group when asked. We had to wait another 5 minutes for them to continue their discussions. It was a very heated evening all around. So tonight we are very privileged to have Dr. Courtney Campbell, philosophy professor at Oregon State University, talk to us both about some of the themes, social issues, racial issues that were raised in the book To Kill a Mockingbird, and some of which, most of which, are still present in our society today, and we're still working on it. He's certainly also free to talk about anything else that he's involved in, and that's multitudes of things. He was chair of the philosophy department, and he also served as director of the program for ethics, science, and the environment, something most of us are very sensitive about. So please give a warm Yachats welcome to Dr. Courtney Campbell.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the hospitality I've received so far. And I have to say, this is really quite impressive, just to for a town that I've pretty much driven through and enjoyed the scenery on the way to have an Academy of Arts and Sciences, and to turn out this size of an audience, frankly, on a Saturday evening is quite remarkable. I think you should, those that organized this, really commendations go to you all. This book, To Kill a Mockingbird, was one that certainly, as with many of you, I'm sure, read in my youth, initially I believe it was in the 9th grade, and was certainly impressed by it. But I don't think I fully quite grasped all its implications, all its meanings, its social resonance. Partly because at that time I was kind of living in a different generation, a different remove from where To Kill a Mockingbird takes place and so forth. And yet, as I've come to appreciate it over the years, and particularly in trying to appropriate some of its themes for this evening's discussion, and I do hope that, insofar as we can be more of an informal kind of discussion, I'll try and get out of my sort of academic lecture mode as much as possible. I do think that it really contains some very timeless themes, some ethical themes as well as literary themes, but the things that I'm going to speak on this evening really have to pertain to ethics. Most particularly, it challenges us to think about how it is that we can live a moral life in an immoral world. That's a perennial question in my discipline. It's a perennial question of life, I think, of one of the great questions. In an immoral world that is permeated by many of these kinds of divisions that separate us, fragment us as human beings. How it is that we can retain our moral bearings, our sense of ethical integrity, in a world that just seems simply bent on oppression of others, injustice, arbitrariness, and the rule of self-interest. There was a theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was actually, his years overlapped somewhat with the publication of this book, but he was very influential in the United States, sort of right prior to and then after World War II. And he's President Obama's favorite theologian. Much has been made of his influence on Obama's foreign policy. But Niebuhr wrote in the 1930s a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And Niebuhr's question was really to try and explore that more from a theological kind of perspective as well as an ethical perspective. Again, the very sorts of issues that I think Harper Lee takes up in a much more narrative form. That is to say, how it is that we preserve our moral character when not only other persons, but the very social structures that seem just beyond our control, beyond the capacity for us to influence to any significant degree. And they're structures that we participate in one form or another, be they political, be they economic, be they social, be they religious, are disposed in one form or another to violate, compromise the dignity of other human persons. How does one deal with that question? I mean, that's sort of the whole theological purpose of Niebuhr that I think Harper Lee gets at in a very interesting kind of way. And again, why, if Niebuhr has the kind of influence that he's had on Obama's foreign policy, and I'm not advocating Obama's foreign policy, just to say that it's kind of, there's a timelessness to the themes, the issues that are raised in this book. And so I have to frankly really also commend this group in the Yachats Commons for taking up some of these issues over the course of your three discussions over the course of this last year. Now think about this broad question, this big question, how it is that in an immoral world or an unjust world we can retain our sense of moral bearing and moral integrity. One can imagine and sort of look at different kinds of postures that have been adopted over the course of the centuries, and I could enumerate these at some length, and I won't, but I just indicate really quickly 5. One is because the world is so awful and oppressive and unjust that the alternative or the posture that's adopted is to withdraw from it, to withdraw into some enclave of protection of one's family, one's own self, some kind of enclave where you can maintain moral rectitude. We see this certainly with a lot of, at least historically, with a lot of religious communities, and still some that persist in our society today. Various kinds of things are objectionable, be it technologies, be it warfare, be it even, how we follow the news, objections to even treatment by medical care by one religious community up in Oregon City. It's been going on the last couple of weeks. That's one posture. You kind of let the world go its own way, and if it falls apart, well, at least you've got your kind of enclave of moral community. There's a second option, what I kind of call the detached critic. The posture of the detached critic, where you sort of stand on the outside of the larger community and offer criticisms of the community based on certain kinds of ideals, certain kinds of values and norms. Either the norms that seem important to you yourself, or perhaps in some cases calling the community to live up to its own standards and its own norms. Now, a lot of this, we have a lot of semi-detached critics, I think, that engage in social criticism on the internet, in the World Wide Web. That's where we find a lot of that kind of criticism. It's often not clear where it is that the source of their norms, their values, come from. Harper Lee is, I think, holding up. I don't think of her as a detached critic per se. I think she offers us a different kind of posture, but in some sense she's certainly raising a question about why it is, some 200 years, roughly by the time this gets published, almost 200 years, 185, that the citizenry of this country hasn't been able to actualize and realize the ideals that are established in the founding documents of the country. So it's not like the ideals or the values are being imported from somewhere else, from some tradition that the citizens themselves don't appreciate, don't acknowledge. It's the failure to live up to those that becomes the real concern. And again, to borrow a phrase from Reinhold Niebuhr, that has become somewhat popular because Martin Luther King Jr. used it in trying to get at some of the issues raised by Harper Lee. The detached critic their responsibility is to speak truth to those that are in power. And in that way, try to affect some kind of change. Now, ultimately, I think sort of the person that personifies that posture to some extent in the book is really that of Atticus. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's a third option, or a third posture. One that I have to say that I sometimes fear. Bill Clinton is or I'm sorry, Dick Clinton, Bill Clinton. That'd be really cool. Bill Clinton was here. Dick Clinton is here from one of my colleagues at OSU, and I have to say that I sometimes fear that the generation of students that I teach, some 30 years younger than myself, see so many problems that seem insurmountable and unresolvable and irreconcilable that they become jaded and simply become indifferent to it. And sort of the sort of momentum and the activism and the synergy towards trying to bring about social change is just very difficult in many any circumstances to move forward. That's not to say, I don't mean to generalize to say that all students are that way, but once problems get to a certain magnitude, a kind of certain threshold, and a cumulative threshold, and whether it be the world's going to end 2 weeks ago, or whether it be global warming, whether it be the issues that are raised in this book that are still with us today, whether it be world hunger, whether it be 3 wars that we're involved in. I mean, one could go on, and at some point there's a kind of threshold of where you sort of kind of throw up your hands. I can only deal with the small patch of garden that I've been given to work in, as Henry David Thoreau once put it. So that's anyway a third posture. And then a fourth posture is simply what I think properly is really focusing on primarily for many of the characters in the book. Certainly not all, but many of them are engaged in a posture of denial. There really isn't any problem at all. If there is, it's very small, very minimal, and with some proper teaching, proper etiquette, proper socialization of someone like Scout into the proper ways of being a Southern young belle and so forth, the world will get back on course and so forth. Now, those are 4 different kinds of postures to deal with this huge problem that I think, huge problem from the standpoint of ethics that is presented by this book. I think, although there are hints and bits and pieces of each of those presented in the book, I think ultimately that were offered by the book and by the main characters in the book really a 5th option, and that's an option or a path of trying to transform the world and deal with these sorts of problems through engagement, not withdrawal, not detachment, not indifference, not denial, but direct engagement with the world. That's how persons, on the one hand, can maintain their integrity as individuals, but also try and affect some kind of change and to move society in the direction of the social norms or the social ideals to which it has aspired for, again, in our particular circumstance. Now, 50 years later, some 235 years since Thomas Jefferson wrote all men were created equal in the Declaration of Independence. For that particular path, of course, there's going to be, that's an important path, but it's not going to be without its own kind of difficulties and controversies. There's going to be moral friction because in some sense you're cutting against the status quo. You have to deal with those that, again, are somewhat in denial and indifference. But it provides in various ways kind of a small step to witnessing to a shared common humanity in the circumstances of its denial or its degradation. Now, with that being said, let me just do a sort of brief overview of how people in my discipline, that is in ethics, try to sort of put the moral world together. So really 3 principal questions of ethics. The first question is what type of person ought I to be? Okay. What type of, in some circumstances, what type of professional ought I to be? That is, the question is concern about our character, the virtues that go into forming who it is that we are, our sense of identity, and who we look up to in terms of exemplars of moral excellence. When I ask my students who they look up to as exemplars of moral excellence, first, I don't think they quite get the question, but it doesn't quite know. But the first, and this is always very striking to me, the first is the parents. That notwithstanding, they're going through some pretty tumultuous times with, you know, on one hand, they're independent, they're on their own, they're trying to figure out how to make it in the world financially and so forth without ruining their parents' tuition accounts and so forth. On the other hand, I mean, they've come to a point where they've sort of pushed beyond sort of the rebellious years of teenage life, and really see that, you know, my father, my mother, whoever it happens to be, that person set the kind of example of person that I aspire to be, at least in certain circumstances. Not that I want to be completely emulative of dear old dad. But that's always very interesting, that comes up almost immediately. When we press further, we ask, well, who might your moral heroes be? That is, people that perform a particularly significant self-sacrificial act. Again, that takes some getting used to, but they tend to think about once I can get them sort of past the celebrities of society, whether they be sports celebrities, whether they be Dancing with the Stars, American Idol type celebrities, Justin Bieber. Then they began to start to think about the question at a deeper level, and then the people like the Mother Teresa's, the Martin Luther King's, the Gandhis, those type of individuals are the people that sort of represent for them the kind of, again, a kind of moral ideal. Who, ask the question, who ought I to be? There's some examples of that sort of speak to that. I think that really, notwithstanding, I'll go on and talk about two other questions of ethics. That, I think, is really the core question of ethics that Harper Lee focuses on, or at least is present in the book. Whether she intended to focus on it or not, it's another question. Second question, so first question pertains to who ought I to be? What type of person ought I to be? Second kind of question that's probably is probably most prevalent in this country in terms of the history of ethics and history of morality, is to ask the question, what kinds of actions ought I to perform? There we get into matters of conduct, matters of rules, the things that we should do, the shalt nots that we should avoid, and so forth. And here you've got kind of an interesting dynamic going on in the book, because on the one hand, there are certain kinds of ways of living, ways of conduct, ways of socialization, particularly the Scout experiences, but she's not the only one in the book, that are matters about how it is that one ought to live, what kinds of rules one ought to conform to, and so forth. Whether you speak, what kinds of clothes speak in public, what kinds of clothes you wear, and so forth. For most of that, those are really matters of etiquette. They're not really matters of ethics. I mean, they're considerations of good manners, but not necessarily of. I mean, they're kind of equivalent to on the golf course. I don't know if there's a golf course anywhere close by, but so, you know, kind of a rule that would say replace your divots after you've taken a hack at the golf ball or something like that. It's again something that's important to etiquette and to good manners, but it doesn't have quite the moral force of don't kill someone, don't kill a mockingbird might have. And then there's a third kind of question that certainly occupies much of the book, and is probably, I think, most embodied in the character of Jim. who struggles with this particular question. And the question here is, I mean, it's part of the larger question: how do we retain morality in a unjust world? But the third question, first question, what type of person ought I to be? Second question, what kinds of actions ought I to perform? Third question, what kinds of outcomes or results ought I to seek? Or ought we as a community to seek and intend? What kind of results do we want? What kind of goals should we aspire towards? Well, at least in the context of the novel, certainly one goal it's aspired to is an outcome of acquittal for Tom Robinson. Beyond that, there's a sort of a larger kind of goal of social equality, racial equality, greater economic equality, at least diminished sense of inequality in society. I think the third kind of aspiration is for those that at least are portrayed in the book and in their sort of contemporary representatives, that they would sort of take their moral blinders off and be able to see others as see other persons as part of the common human fellowship. The difficulty with one's sort of focusing one's ethical concerns on sort of outcomes and results and goals is because we're finite human beings, we lack the capacity to control those outcomes. We lack the capacity to even predict what those outcomes are going to be. And so, at least in the case of Jem, he's confronted, particularly after the verdict isn't what he'd anticipated, with what, again, to go back to Niebuhr refers to sort of the irony of history, that you try to be the best type of person that you can be, you try to engage in the kinds of actions that you think are appropriate, and you don't achieve the desired outcome. In this particular instance, instead of the acquittal, you have the conviction of Tom, and of course the sequelae to that, imprisonment, and ultimately his death. And he repeats several times, if you recall in the novel, to his father, to others, it just ain't right. It ain't right. You've done the right thing, you've tried to be the right kind of person. And the outcome is beyond your capacity to control. It's perhaps within the capacity of, say, 12 people on a jury to control, but you're outside of that loop. That's where the kind of moral friction, that's where occurs, that's where the test of one's convictions occurs. How can one retain one's ideals, and if you can't achieve a truly just world, at least move towards a less unjust world. That's the real challenge, that's the moral challenge that Jem is facing in this book, at least towards the end, sort of post-conviction. Anyway, those are the three questions, the three basic questions of ethics. It's really striking to me that they're all present in the book in one form or another, and embodied by one character or another, more or less. Now, what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is, actually, let me just stop right there. So I've gone on for about 25 minutes, and still got some more to discuss. But let me just see if you have any questions that you would want to raise just right now. Yeah?
Yeah, just a quick question. What year was it when you first read the book?
Oh boy. It would probably have been about 1960, no, not really. About 1970, I'm guessing.
Pardon?
1970. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Having seen the movie many times, never having read the book, are they very much the same? Are they? No.
Yeah, there's, well, and that's always probably true of any novel that's adapted to the book. You're always going to have some slippage. Obviously, I think one of the, that movie, for a lot of people that haven't read it, they're still in the same situation. People that ask me about the book or ask me about To Kill a Mockingbird, what do I know about it? But most of them will have the connection through the movie because particularly the performance of Gregory Peck was so powerful to many people. Yeah, Tom.
So if a person takes on one of these three as their main way of approaching their moral life, either what kind of person, or what kind of acts, or what kind of outcome, there's got to be pluses and minuses for each one of those approaches.
Right, yeah, definitely. And I try to indicate a little bit what was sort of the downside with the sort of outcomes-oriented approach, that you try as you might, you just don't have the capacity to control the outcomes of our action, or predict the outcomes of our action. So you don't want to put all your sort of ethical eggs in that particular basket, I think. There's certainly downsides to the emphasis on good character. Good character is important, but again, it's somewhat focused on self-actualization, self-development, and sometimes doesn't issue in sort of transformation of the social world. Okay, if I'm focused on, just go back to the cardinal virtues of Western society from the Greeks. If I'm focused on justice and on me developing the virtues of justice and temperance and courage and prudence or practical wisdom, and then the theological virtues come later of faith, hope, and love. Well, again, I'm somewhat inward focused. Okay, and those may or may not lead to any kind of effort to sort of engage other people. And the difficulty with the sort of focus on conduct only, well, one difficulty, I think the difficulty that certainly Harper Lee holds up is the difficulty of trying to live up to whatever the ideals rules are, the issue of hypocrisy. That's always going to be nipping at our heels. And sometimes we engage in what one of my colleagues calls moral self-deception, that we tend to think we're doing it a little bit better on some of these rules of conduct than we might always be. But there's also a sense that the rule-focused or conduct-focused doesn't demand enough of ourselves. Okay, it can be very, very. One example would be to say that our moral, for some people, our moral lives are. This is particularly since I primarily focus on medical ethics in my professional life. A good deal of the discussion of medical ethics of professionals and patient relationships is focused on what's called an ethic of contract, okay, which is ratified through notions, if you go through, go see a doctor or so forth, ratified through informed consent procedures. Well, contracts have their merit. On the other hand, they just say the minimal level that you have to abide by, the minimal kinds of actions that you engage in to sort of fulfill the contract. Then your relationship is sort of entered. And they don't really, what's missing from the ethics of contract or the ethics of action is really an aspiration for higher ideals. So, I mean, ultimately, with these three questions, these three sort of central questions to ethics, you want to have a really kind of balanced approach to all of these. You don't want to sort of have, the sort of theoreticians of moral philosophy and moral theology throughout the ages have really focused on one or the other, and how we get to sort of balance the three questions or answer these three questions in our lives is a very difficult matter. But you're quite right to say each of them has their own limitations. And some of those limitations are, I think, again, illustrated in the book. I wasn't going to really go much into this, but since you raised the point, Atticus, I'm going to come to this in a minute. I mean, one of the major moral aspects of the book, the themes of the book, is sort of embedded in the theme of imagination. But Atticus continually teaches his children that they need to walk a mile in another person's shoes. He can't really make any sort of assessment of others until you've lived in their own skin, as one of his children, who's that Scout, well, actually this is what he says to Scout. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around it. That's what he says to Scout, sort of after the first day, her first day at school, when she's had a pretty tough day I guess everyone has a tough first day of school. She's had a tough first day with a bully at school, and she's had a tough day trying to figure out what's the deal with her teacher. And Atticus is suggesting, okay, you need to step back a little bit, think about, sort of the perspective and the experience that these other people have. He gets so caught up in that, of course, that towards the end of the book, when Bob Ewell assaults him in the street, at least spits on him and so forth, and says he's kind of going to come after him. He tells his son, Jem, basically this gives him the same advice. Jem, see if you can stand in Bob Ewell's shoes for a minute. I destroyed his last shred of credibility at that trial. And because he's so focused on trying to see things from the other person's point of view, which for the most part is a very laudable characteristic, I think we'd all agree with that. But there comes a point where some discernment is needed. And so he tends to downplay the threat that Bob Ewell actually is to himself, or more particularly to his family. So again, I mean, it's very striking to me that Harper Lee sort of raises the limit. On the one hand, is praising, or at least commending, I think, through Atticus, notions of imagination and integrity, and yet at the same time, he's also limited. He's got some limits, and they place his family in substantial jeopardy towards, as the novel starts to tend towards its climax. Any other questions before? Yeah.
In the book, it explains that the trial, which takes place in 1935, it's at the height of the Depression, women were not allowed to serve on criminal juries in Alabama. And therefore, there are no women on the jury. Most of the working men, who maybe have very much like Atticus, are a quiet population underneath the accepted norms. They don't want to serve on juries either because they don't want to get involved, and they're busy working. They're the only people making money during the Depression.
Right.
So in some ways, it's the other Atticus, the silent Atticuses, who have decided to not enter the fray and not to stand up. And only people left to serve on the juries are the people like the accuser, Bob Ewell.
Good.
And that's what you get, that's what society gets when people with ideals run away from the problem.
Right, yeah, really excellent observation. Again, all it takes for evil, you've heard this many times, all it takes for evil to triumph in the world is for good persons to be silent. So that's persons of conscience, on the other hand, are going to, again, the way I describe the path I think she's commending is not detachment, not withdrawal, it's engagement. And through engagement, you transform the society. Okay? So it's on the one hand, you're talking about what type of person you are, but you're also engaged in an action that you anticipate. You have hopes. You can't have guarantees, but you have hopes that will engage in social transformation.
Well, that's where it gets back to conduct. I think the issue of conduct is really the most important because that's the one thing that you can control. You can't control someone else's behavior or conduct, but you can control your own.
Right.
And so whatever your aspirations are, whatever your thoughts are, whatever your meanings are, what you do about it is what's essential. And that's your conduct, and that can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but still, it's your actions that are going to be seen by the other people that are involved.
Right. Very good, astute observation. Because some of the, our moral character, I mean, this would take us a little bit far afield for this evening. Our moral character, of course, is shaped, just as my students' moral characters are shaped, by things beyond their control, okay? Their upbringing, their socialization, peers, and so forth. When you reach, at least at some level, degree of moral maturity, and you hopefully can make decisions between right and wrong, or to the lesser of evils or the greater of goods, ultimately it's your conduct that you do have the kind of control over. Again, we could go real far afield on that in terms of ultimately do we have free will and those kind of questions. But anyway, I think your observation is really good. Okay, let me just move ahead and talk about sort of what was advertised in the brochures, which had to do with these three principal themes. It'll take 45 minutes to get through the introduction, so no, that's not quite true. So first I want to talk about the notion of imagination and how that relates to the notion of moral imagination as one prominent theme in this particular book. Imagination, obviously, is a very important narrative device. It's how we connect with books like this or whatever book that you're reading. Is somehow you imagine yourself, at least I do when I read this, and I imagine I'm using the same language here, assume that you have a similar kind of experience. I can sort of see myself in my mind's eye walking with German Scout. I can see imagine myself in that courtroom, at least observing that courtroom. I guess probably in that courtroom, since I have so many lawyers in my family. I can sort of know what that's like, or even walking home late at night, some of the apprehensions, particularly as a young child, you might have about walking. So imagination is a very important literary rhetorical device to make us connect with the experience of the characters. It's also an important context or matrix for the development of ethics, and let me just explain that a little bit. And again, I sort of already touched on this. It's really the idea that your imagination has to try to understand the world through the experience of other people. And that leap of imagination is what, at least in my field, we refer to not simply as imagination, we refer to it as moral imagination, because you're trying to engage in a process by which the world that is different than your own, the one that you've experienced, you're trying to transcend that, move beyond that, and try to experience or at least see the world through the eyes of someone else. And so, as I mentioned before, Atticus makes that comment to Scout about you really never understand a person until you consider his things from his point of view. Climb into his skin and walk around it. And then at one of the critical moments of the book, Atticus, I mean, this is when Atticus faces down the mob that comes, the lynch mob that comes to break into the prison where Tom Robinson is held. And he's able to sort of display of courage, but also aided by his children at that point, coming unbeknownst to them into a situation of grave danger. But that, recall that the intervention of the children, and particularly the intervention of Scout at that time, trying to make some, what seems on the one level, small talk conversation with Mr. Cunningham, by talking about his son and so forth. Well, what's she doing there? She's trying to make a human connection. She's trying to express their common humanity. And Atticus says to his children after that event that what you did there proves something. That a gang of wild animals, now notice how it's phrasing there, they're not human beings, they're wild animals. That a gang of wild animals can be stopped simply because they're still human. Okay, I mean, very interesting juxtaposition there. You've got on the one hand, they're behaving like wild animals, but there's still something human in them that you've connected with, or you've tried to connect to. Because they're still human, you children made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a moment. Okay, again, Walter Cunningham is now trying to, at least in Atticus's eyes, is seeing the world through Atticus. And that, Atticus says, was enough. That was enough to get that particular lynch mob to back down. So this idea of the moral imagination, again, is trying to experience the world in as so far as possible through another's perception. And that's important because it reaffirms a sense of common humanity. It evokes, because of that, a sense of empathy and compassion for others, and takes us beyond ourselves so that we're with others in the midst of their sufferings. And these are kind of bridging sentiments. They bridge different worlds, different experiential worlds, and different persons. It affirms the imagination, and empathy affirms a sense of personal humility on our part, which, again, a mob of at least we wouldn't call them really. I mean, they were a social elite and perhaps part of an economic elite, not necessarily an intellectual elite, but they didn't have any kind of personal humility. So the imagination affirms that sense of personal humility that we all need to have in trying to understand other people. We acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge. And because of that, it brings us open to relationships. Okay, it brings us open to community. It's that affirmation of the common humanity. Now, as we talked about earlier, there can be limits to this, and Atticus puts himself in great danger, puts his family in particular in great danger, because he has such an optimistic view of human nature, and in particular Bob Ewell's human nature, that it becomes, again, it's somewhat, he overstates his faith in shared humanity. Okay, the second sort of major theme I want to focus on is that of integrity. We have very common expressions, again, to get at this particular theme. We talk about having the courage of your convictions. We talk about walking your talk. Unfortunately, integrity tends to be experienced more by its absence in our experience than by its presence. We're very hypercritical of, say, politicians, for example, because we think that this is the character trait that they should have, but they don't. And thus it's very difficult for us to trust them. It's very interesting that this particular aspect of lack of integrity is the sin that's most commented on in all the religious texts of the world, whether it be Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, is the language of hypocrisy, the lack of integrity. That's, again, a moral failure that seems to be universal. Or even in the book itself, sort of the plight, what Atticus ultimately refers to as the polite fictions of Southern life. That is, again, etiquette, a sense of politeness towards others, but it leads people in the missionary society that's set up by Aunt Alexandria. They talk about how awful the state of affairs is, if you recall, for the blacks in Africa, and how one of the local ministers was trying to come to the rescue of the fate of individuals in Africa, and just don't seem to get it that there's something really seriously out of whack with segregation within their own community, and the ostracization of what we would now call African Americans. At the time, I don't think that was part of the language when Harper Lee wrote this book. Or even one of the individuals at the trial, Tom Robinson, who goes on and on about how problematic it is for Hitler to be persecuting the Jews. No question. No one's going to call that into question. But again, not to see that there's a problem right before your eyes and somehow to miss it. That's the kind of exposure of moral hypocrisy that the book is frankly wonderful at getting at, and why this theme of integrity is so important, because ultimately, I think, despite some of his limitations, Atticus does become sort of the moral hero of this particular book. Let me just say a couple of things about integrity in terms of how it's expressed and displayed in the book. Atticus, one way in which we might talk about integrity is sort of this consistency between how one is in private and how one is in the public sector, okay, in one's public life. And again, you can think of a lot of people very, very quickly where their private persona and their public persona are going to be two very kind of different things, and there's a kind of moral disconnect there. But Atticus has a reputation amongst the people in the community, as expressed by Miss Mahdi to Scott, that he's the same in his house as he is on the public streets. I mean, there isn't any disconnect or slippage there. He's the same kind of person, which means he's going to be trustworthy, he's going to be reliable, his word is as good as his bond. The second way in which we might talk about integrity is the capacity to live with one's conscience, which is, I think it goes back to your question, your observation earlier. Atticus, is somewhat challenged by his children to explain why it is that he decided that he would take this case. There's some background to that in terms of the judge selecting him as the public defender when most of the cases go to someone else that perhaps might not have been so capable of carrying out a reasonable defense. But Atticus, in thinking through this and trying to explain to children that are still relatively young why this is important to him, why he's willing to put his life on the line by defending the person not only in court, but by protecting him against the lynch mob and so forth. It has to do with being able to live with oneself, living with one's conscience. Okay, and that goes back to the issue of what type of person I can be. And Atticus is not going to be the type of person that betrays the best of who he is. So he talks to, at one point early on in the book, he talks to Scout, and he says, before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. It's a very powerful kind of statement there. It's very similar to, especially that notion about not abiding by majority rule is one's conscience. I mean, it's very similar to what Henry David Thoreau said, that any person who is right constitutes a majority of one, and that's the majority that counts. He later goes on in, again, trying to explain to his children another sort of example or illustration from the text. When you and Jem are grown, so he's having another conversation with Scout, when you and Jem are grown, maybe you'll look back on this case with some compassion and some feeling that I didn't let you down. The concerned parent here. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes to the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man. There's, in a sense, I can't live with myself if I don't engage in this particular way of standing up for justice, standing up for equality, standing up for the dignity of human persons. And again, so much that I wouldn't be able to live myself, I'm willing to put my own life on the line in trying to face down that lynch mob. Third way in which we might talk about integrity that's sort of presented in the book is integrity as a sense of wholeness or completeness of person. Again, this sort of has some classical roots that I won't really go into now, but there's a view that's expressed particularly by Alexandra in the book, where one's morality is sort of shaped by one's heredity. And at one point when she comes to live with the family, she wants to make sure that the children live up to the family name, live up to the Finch name. And I have to say that I really do connect with that. I really relate to that because I had a father who was very strict about what the Campbell name meant, and living up to that particular name, and the values associated with that name. But Atticus rightly points out, rightly comes to the conclusion that morality isn't a matter of what one has socially inherited from one's parents or others or one's culture. One has to, if one is to be a true moral being, a complete moral being, one has to move beyond that. And so he ultimately tells, after he sort of tries to defend Alexander, he really, he ultimately says, just forget what I told you, I don't want you to remember it. Which is, again, coming in the context of the South and the importance of history and culture, particular cultural history in the South, a very strong statement. Don't remember it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't define who you are. Ultimately, what you do and the type of what you do, your conduct, and the type of person you aspire to be, that defines who you are, morally and socially. A third theme, and this is one I'm going to conclude on, and then we'll have some more discussion, take some more questions, is I was going to go in the direction of friendship because it's there in the book in some very interesting ways, but I decided I would just kind of leave that for another discussion. So I just wanted to focus in conclusion here on sort of the ethics of innocence and vulnerability. There is clearly a sense of, one of the reasons that this book is so poignant and so powerful is because it is, in a certain way, a coming of age tale, particularly for Scout. Innocence is also part of the book in terms of certainly questions of legal innocence. That is, Hans innocent of false accusations and charges made against him. But there's also the issue of moral innocence, which really is the obviously the phrasing for this for the title of the book, "To Kill a Mockingbird." And what Atticus says, sort of by the by, to Jem and Scout at one point, that it's just remember it's after they've have been given some air guns to shoot. Says, go ahead with the Blue Jays, that's fine, but just remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. And they don't quite get it, so Scout, being the very sharp but still light, innocent girl that she is, asks what this means to Miss Maudie. Miss Maudie explains it to her. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for the rest of us to enjoy. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. That is to say, there's something greater than that we should focus our aspirations on. There's something of beauty, ultimately. Why is it after all wrong to kill a mockingbird? Well, they do something without any kind of concern about reciprocity. They do nothing, at least according to Miss Maudie, but sing their hearts out for us. It's kind of the purest example of altruism that one could imagine. Now, obviously mockingbirds do a lot of other things, but at least that's the persona that they play, or that's the role they play in the book as sort of the formative metaphor for the book and the title. They point us to these higher ideals, these ideals of beauty, these ideals of music, and other ideals of wisdom and compassion and altruism, because they do something for others, okay, and without any expectation of return or reciprocal response. And so Scout finally sort of glimpses this. She finally gets it. She doesn't get it initially, but towards right in sort of the climactic scene of the book, where Mr. Ewell has been killed, and Mr. Tate comes to the house, and Atticus initially is trying to say, no, we have to do things according to the law, and that finally gets resolved so that Atticus is willing to defer to Mr. Tate, the sheriff, on this, and just say that the death of Bob Ewell occurred through this particular knife that went into him from his own knife. And Atticus is trying to explain this to Scout, and of course the concern about who's being protected here is Mr. Radley, the person that sort of ultimately came to their rescue. Scout responds to him, well, if we'd gone the way that you wanted to do it, Dad, it'd be sort of like killing a mockingbird, wouldn't it? She finally gets that point, and it's a very telling, very powerful point, that you don't want to ruin, destroy someone else's innocence, someone else's integrity, for the sake of, say, legal fastidiousness to the rules, which is initially the way that Atticus wanted to go with this. So what's really nice about that particular exchange, interplay, is it brings up, it really ties the three themes I've tried to focus on together. On the one hand, Scout is making the leap of moral imagination. She's understanding what it must have been like, or she's trying to understand what it would have been like for Mr. Radley, for her to say it would have been like killing a mockingbird is to try and see the world through Mr. Radley's viewpoint. On the other hand, Atticus's integrity is, you could say, well, he's finally, backed off a little bit from following the rule of law. He's willing to defer to the sheriff of this, so he's able to preserve a sense of personal integrity and character, because he sees that there's a kind of higher good that's being pursued here. And then obviously there's the issue about innocence and the protection of innocence, the protection of, whether it's the mockingbird, whether it's the children, whether it's Mr. Radley, of individuals that do something for other people without any sense of any expectation of reciprocity, just altruistic behavior. Quite in contrast to the kind of sort of self-interestedness that leads to racism, that leads to segregation and so forth, that makes up a good part of what really is criticizing. So with that, again, to me, this book has the power that it has because it does raise this timeless question for us, this timeless challenge that we all struggle with. How do we retain our integrity as persons in a world that is difficult to live in at best? To use Reinhold Niebuhr's phrase again, is an immoral world. And how do we continue to aspire towards certain ideals, such as beauty, such as altruism, compassion, wisdom, the innocence of children? I mean, after all, in the foundational biblical text, Jesus says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." I mean, there's a real powerful resonance of the innocence of children that's being played off of here. But how do we retain those ideals, given the sort of, to use Shakespeare's phrase, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? It's no easy task. It's very, very difficult to do that. And yet I think that, again, the power of To Kill a Mockingbird is it shows one way to do that. This path of engagement and transformation of the world through engagement. And so ultimately, I think that we might not have consensus about the answers that the book raises, or that might be represented in this particular set of papers behind me. We might not have answers, but I think that Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird has raised questions that none of us can ignore if we have aspirations to make a better world for everyone. Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. We can open it up for a little bit more informal discussion at this point. Yeah.
One of the things that your kind of discussion leads to and is really valuable is our own awareness of our own moral stature in the midst of, call it, an immoral world. What the factor that's hard to then piece into the picture is the communal thing that puts moral people together, so that they don't just look at the world from a moral stance, but are unable to do anything about it, but somehow find support in one another. And I think that's a really important factor, and I don't know how it fits into the picture, but it has to somehow, because otherwise we all just become very, very intelligent purists who look at the world, but we're not sure how to deal with any one of these things. Where do we go to deal with what we see?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and although the way I phrased those questions was really individualistic in the sense that I said, what type of person ought I to be, what should I perform, what outcome should I seek, and I mean, I think they can be stated, often should be stated more collectively and communally. You know, I think within the book itself, you've got different sets of communities that are bound together by some competing, some shifting interests. But you know, I mean, I think there's a kind of sense in which even for example, the disagreement between the sheriff and Atticus on how to figure out what to do with Bob Ewell's death towards the end. I mean, they have this disagreement, and at first it's a misunderstanding, and then it's sort of a disagreement, and then ultimately the sheriff says, "This is what I'm going to do," and the sheriff in this county, and this is my call on this one. But they're bound together there by a shared commitment to, I don't want to make it too abstract, but I think they're bound together by a shared commitment to justice and fairness. And the avoidance, or insofar as possible, they're bound together by a shared commitment to protect persons that are vulnerable in the society. Again, whether they're metaphorically described as the Mockingbirds or other kinds of ways. So, you know, I think there are sort of moral communities in the book. Now, the issue is, I think that you rightly raise, is, well, at some point the moral, if there are these moral communities that are committed to these certain ideals, what gives them the motivation, what gives them the energy to actually really seek out the change that's needed? In this case, okay, there's been one death of an innocent person. I mean, at least as the book describes, in the context of deaths and enslavement of millions of people. But at least here we're talking about the death of one innocent person. Again, that sort of violates the standard of justice, that the guilty and only the guilty should be punished. That's clearly violated in this particular, in this scenario that's played in this particular book. But given that, what is it that, it can't only be, much as sometimes moral philosophers might want to think of this way, it can't only be the commitment to the moral ideal that provides the motivation. I think that, part of what, I guess I draw an individual that was, since I've used Reinhold Niebuhr a lot, one of the influences on Reinhold Niebuhr was a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber. Max Weber described what he called charismatic personalities as the most revolutionary force in the world. And he had in mind, when he used that, sort of examples of Jesus in the West and Buddha in the East. But so you not only need people that are committed to certain ideals, but someone that really has sort of the people are drawn to an individual. In the case of civil rights, they were drawn to Martin Luther King because of his soaring oratory. And not unlike, not to dismiss or understate what he accomplished, but his willingness to lay his life on the line and bring people along because I to be try about this, because he had a vision, because he had a dream, and people shared that dream, shared that vision. So ultimately, it's not only the commitment to the moral ideal, it's this vision of the possibility of transformation. And ultimately, for us to get there, it goes back to that theme of imagination. We've got to be able to share not only the moral rectitude of something, but the transformation of possibility.
You're also talking about leadership.
Certainly,
The
yeah.
charismatic personality, it doesn't have to be that charismatic as Jesus Christ, but
Right.
leadership. I mean, a lot of people sit down and come up with ideas and talk about what they agree with, what they don't agree with, what's moral, what their principles are. But in order to affect change, you probably need leadership.
Yeah, you need people to be willing to sort of take the next step forward and to move out of, you know, the various kinds of comfort zones that we all are accustomed to. It's very easy. Well, I can't say. I don't want to speak for you on this. It's easy for me to stay in my comfort zone. I mean, I have a good job at a relatively decent university. It has its problems that drive me nuts. But it's easy for me to stay in my comfort zone in terms of sort of where I am in my life, socially, economically, and so forth. But there would be, I think it'd be a moral failing on my part, a kind of deficiency, if I just, you know, holed up in the ivory tower the whole day and sort of, you know, read interesting books and so sort of fed my own mind and didn't try to engage in various environmental causes, engage in various kinds of issues to promote education amongst the youth of my particular town, Corvallis, to do things that really make me stretch. And I don't want to point myself out here as a kind of moral exemplar by any means, but you know, I spent the first 8, I'm reminded of this because of the gymnasium hoops here. I spent, you know, the first 8 hours today with you know, high school girls freshman basketball team. There are some really interesting life lessons that you learn playing basketball and coaching basketball, particularly if you're gray and old and sort of beyond the, I mean, I'm ancient history, frankly, to the girls that I coach. And so I get stretched in enormous ways. And hopefully I'm able to impart some sense of life lessons and life skills besides, there are more important things than winning or losing a game. Well, that sometimes is really, really important. But anyway, I mean, I guess the general point, you know, I'm trying to make is, you know, each of us can enlarge our circles of influence. Whether we take on various leadership roles in the community, there are different ways that we can do that. Yeah.
I like the point at the end of the movie, at least, where the Atticus and the sheriff are debating whether it has to be handled in the conventional legal way or whether there's a higher truth. Now, I wonder, is there some inherent right for, say, the tyrant or the torturer to the truth? You know, can you pursue the truth in such an unacceptable way that really people do not have an obligation to give it to you? Now, I know this sounds relative, but...
Let's see, I'm trying to, I'm not sure I quite...
Okay, well, if the truth is tyrannically demanded, does the victim have any obligation to give it?
Okay. Well, I guess with respect to the truth being, we should prosecute this particular crime in one particular way rather than another, or follow the rules of law. I think that I don't know. I mean, this. I don't mean to be. I think if, you know, a tyrant demands the truth of a victim, insofar as it's possible, you know, the victim should refuse the truth. I mean, they have to be able to live with their own conscience. The next step after that is if you're under the rule of some tyrant, and sometimes the tyrant can be the rule of law,
Right.
okay, that the tyrant needs to be overthrown, rebelled against. I mean, again, part of what Martin Luther King did, actually, a few years before To Kill a Mockingbird was published, is he picks up this notion that goes back to the Stoics about there are some laws that are just and there are some laws that are unjust. And if you face an unjust law, then you have no obligation to conform to it. In fact, your obligation is to refuse to conform to it, which landed him, of course, in prison. But from prison, he writes his letter from Birmingham City Jail, one of the most famous documents of American political writing in the 20th century. Similarly, I mean, so I would say that the victim, to avoid being further victimized by the tyrant, needs to refuse. And that might mean, again, that the path ultimately becomes one of martyrdom. But martyrs can bear witness to greater truths. Then, if there's some possibility to overturn that particular tyrant, the tyranny of the law, the tyranny of the majority, which Thoreau was concerned about. What was Thoreau concerned about? Why did he write his essay on civil disobedience? He felt that the two things, the Mexican-American War, as we refer to it, was he wasn't going to pay taxes for that. All of us face that, I think, with respect to the wars that our country is engaged in right now. That's a real hard question, I think, for all of us. I mean, Thoreau didn't have, if Yachats became known as the community of tax resistors in the United States on the war issue, I mean, that would be very interesting to find out how that would be treated. And I just think it's a very difficult kind of question. Thoreau didn't have, the consequences weren't as significant for Thoreau. I mean, one night in prison, but his exchange with Ralph Waldo Emerson, you recall, Emerson comes to visit him in prison, and he says, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau says, Ralph, what are you doing out there? And that's, I think, Thoreau's saying something. Where does the greater tyranny lie, so to speak? Okay, complicity with these larger structures, social structures, whether it be racism, whether it be militarism, and so forth. Our own kind of complicity in those. And then obviously the other thing that Thoreau was objecting to was slavery. And so those were two things that motivated his essay, Civil Disobedience. So that's my best way of kind of getting at your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
One of the things on the theme, I think, of integrity that you brought up that really brought me back to our last event. The teenagers in the group that Don was talking about.
These
really
are the ones
latched
that were dealing with racism.
Intolerance
Yeah.
and racism together. One of the things they really zeroed in on, and they were using current examples from today and some of the behavior of our country in relation to President Obama, is that, that there seem to be inconsistencies or lack of integrity in how we treat a member of a certain race, and that we essentially use a different standard of behavior because we believe a different standard of behavior can be applied because that person is of a different race.
Mm-hmm.
And they really pulled out that it really wasn't just a blind spot of a lack of integrity or inconsistency, but that that they were, and much like Jem, this isn't right, and they were really mad, you know, that we're applying this different set of rules of behavior to this person just because, in the words of the book, or just because they're an N-word, you know, and that makes it okay.
Yeah.
And anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there because it really brought me back to that, and I just didn't know if you had any further comments on sort of that difference between the blind spot and the more sort of
Kind of
conscious application of a different set of rules.
more willful
Yeah.
attitude, more willful kind of, which, you know, I mean, it's, I mean, frankly, it's really appalling, isn't it? I mean, you know, November 2008, I think is, I can't remember the precise date, some of you probably can give me the precise date here, but anyway, November 2008 was, I think, an enormous, should be one of the great days in American history, because it seemed like we had really crossed the threshold to be able to elect African American as president. You know, 104 years after we fought, you know, a civil war that cost 600,000 casualties, or 600,000 soldiers' deaths, let alone other kinds of casualties. 40 years, roughly 45 years after we passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, you know, on the one, I mean, there was a, you know, a kind of, I have to say I was kind of caught up in the emotion of the moment, because you know, I think all of us in this room can probably remember when things were very, very different, and people would say that's never going to happen, and yet it happened in our lifetimes. And so when people get somewhat disconsolate about, you know, this, you know, we're not getting very far with solving some of these great, you know, social problems that we have, be it racism, sexism, and so forth, I think you can say, well, again, in another kind of culture, another kind of place, this just isn't going to happen. So there's something commendable, I mean, just euphoric about what happened. And then with electing Obama as president, and then we've kind of regressed. And it's very dismaying, it's very disappointing. Now, is that because of economic concerns? I say that has something to do with it, but is it just the residue of the racism that, you know, has been in this country for, you know, since its inception in the colonies, at least the southern colonies in the 17th century for 400 years, essentially. That we just, remember how I mentioned a couple times, morality is not social heredity, but you need at some point to get beyond that. That's the lesson that Atticus is teaching his children when he says, you do not have to live up to the name Finch, because that's going to limit ultimately who you are. Well, again, sort of to break out of the residues of racism, be they more explicit or sort of latent, we have to think of morality as more than just the kind of social inheritance that we picked up from the previous generation. My sense is with the younger generation, they're more, because they don't know a world like you and I know of, I don't know, the civil rights protests and so forth, and all that. They see the movies, but they're in black and white, so they don't really count. You know, but those for us, we kind of lived through that period when we kind of understood what was going on. You know, for this generation, I think that, I mean, I have some real high aspirations for this generation because they've experienced a different kind of world you know, and I have hopes that they'll be able to, you know, make advances on that. But I think that, you know, again, whether it's this nasty politics, you know, I think the, you know, the birther movement, the Tea Party movement, I don't mean to go too political here, but I just find that they're really, you know, very, very narrow in the kinds of understandings they have about the ideals of the country, the standards, and I guess this is the first point I wanted to say, and I just kind of walked right past it. The problem is we can't get to the integrity issue because we haven't dealt with the imagination issue. Okay, that's why I sort of set those up sequentially. If we would understand what it would mean to be an African American, if we could try to walk in that person's skin, to use Atticus language as a scout, for a person that's been born of a Kenyan father, raised most of his life in Hawaii, and so if we can walk in that, if we can just try and imagine that circumstance, as hard as it is going to be, I know, but just try to make that leap of imagination, then I think we can get to the integrity issue. But it's the sort of shutting down of the imagination that I think is the fundamental problem. Yeah, I don't know if you do want to.
No, I have
a question. I thought you were going to close me down.
I do some work in human rights related to environment. And one of the things that they are saying about human rights stuff is that the idea of human rights doesn't really develop until the novel developed in the 18th century. And portraiture of ordinary people. And the idea there is that somehow now people in power can look inside other people's lives with novels and portraitures and imagine themselves as having some moral relationship or obligation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that body of work. I mean, that's very, very interesting. Sort of the Prince and the Pauper kind of phenomenon, but sort of writ as part of the human experience. So that's really quite interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to give an example of how Yachats may put itself on the map yet again, and also be able to think from somebody else's shoes. We just celebrated Memorial Day. We had 50 U.S. flags up and down both sides of the highway. Everybody thought it was great. A few people were upset because they didn't get one in front of their business. But we had some area residents that suggested we also display the flags of the countries that we've been at war with and whose citizens we killed, and raise the level of this whole discussion beyond just the, very unqualified respect we owe all the military for this country, but also the ones that we killed. And that's a whole different level of discussion. And maybe a new discussion about war. Is war, is that the answer?
Yeah. That'd be a very powerful community exercise to engage in. I've not seen that sort of publicly sort of put together organized by one community. I mean, I think that would be a very powerful kind of idea. I teach, one of the courses I teach at OSU, I teach a course on nonviolence, just war, and terrorism, so there's that aspect of me. But I also teach a course on death and dying, and one of the things that we do, besides visiting cemeteries, really interesting thing for the students, try to put, there's my imagination thing running a little bit amok, and you try and put yourself in the shoes of the dead person. Okay, really good idea. One of the things that we do is when we go to the cemeteries, I have, which many of them have, we pass by veteran cemeteries and so forth, veterans grave sites, I should say. But then we talk about, on the one hand, you know, the dignity that we owe to the people that, you know, have fought for various liberties and so forth on this country, but also the lives of the other, that have been taken, you know, in that, on, you know, whether it's enemies or as quote-unquote collateral damage and so forth. And that those people, no less than anyone else, that's that common humanity that we share with them. So, and again, I think that's why, I mean, that was kind of my first point with To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, it's the notion of imagination teaches you about this common humanity that we share. On the campus at Oregon State, and they can back me up on this a little bit, I mean, every now and then we will have sort of what certain kind of insignia that will be representative of how many people, how many U.S. soldiers have been killed in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then, sort of matched by those will be flags planted for how many, you know, approximately, or the proportion amount of how many Iraqi civilians have been killed, how many Iraqi troops have been killed, how many Afghan civilians have been killed. So, I mean, and those, and so again, in this one class tonight, I mean, we will walk by those and talk about those, that as much as we want to and definitely respect, you know, the sacrifices, again, go back to the Kill a Mockingbird kind of idea, the sacrifices that soldiers give for this country and its values, there is a larger human community that we need to recognize. And many of those are mockingbirds as well, people that have had their lives taken who are innocent. So that would be a very powerful community experiment, I think. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering what you would say about how these little things and the internet has changed the world, and how I haven't heard any reference tonight to how all of this has changed, whether it was Egypt and the way they communicated, or does this change anything?
Well, let me toss it back to you first. What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah.
Yesterday, I had my coffee, looked at the beautiful ocean. It was the bluest I've ever seen. I put up on my Facebook, beautiful day in Yachats. Ocean is bluer than I've ever seen. Yachats, where nature happens every day. In less than 1 minute, a matter of seconds, I had a response from someone in New Zealand that generated a whole discussion yesterday from that one post.
And you posted that on your Facebook page?
Yeah.
That's amazing, boy. No one pays attention to my Facebook. I'm pretty disillusioned with that. Yeah, obviously. Well, I mean, my kids will tell me I need to do something with my Facebook page. No, you're onto something that. I mean, I guess I didn't touch much on it because, you know, it's really not part of the book per se. But does it change how we can experience the world, how we can experience new worlds? For you to have a conversation, you know, from someone in New Zealand, there's a profound sense of, I mean, that indicates to some extent our global interconnectedness, that broader human community that, again, Harper Lee was trying to speak to out of her own experience, at least for the white community in Alabama at the time. There's a broader human community out there. Get in touch with that. And so technology certainly provides those kinds of opportunities, and has, I mean, this might go back or dovetail with the question about leadership before and social activism. I mean, it certainly has seemed to have it provides the momentum for mobilization in many countries. I mean, we've seen that with the Arab Spring, that without Facebook, without cell phones, without pictures being posted that are being transmitted to the news media, and so forth. We're probably clueless, or it may about what's going on, or it might not have ever occurred, because you think, I'm just one isolated individual, how is my protest going to make any difference against a Gaddafi or a Mubarak or someone like that? So to that extent, I mean, I think that there's something very profound about the technologies that, in terms of force for mass mobilization, that has transformed societies for good. No question about that. There's also a way in which I think they can be, I have to say, I don't have a good example here because I left my cell phone back in the house, so I could make sure that it wouldn't ring when I was, but no one ever calls me yet. But I have to say there's a way in which it can become very depersonalizing as well. And again, if you go on any college campus, and in between classes, there's no face-to-face engagement. This is what students are doing. And I'm just amazed how we do not have mass collusions, on our campus. I mean, I don't know whether they're hearing people as they're stepping in it, but it's just going along. Maybe it's the peripheral vision, but so there's a way in which it can be, somewhat depersonalizing. You lose the facial contact. Body language is so important a part of our communication. If it's just, it's one thing to do words and text and so forth, but there's, something, I guess maybe I'm somewhat of a traditionalist, but, we speak with our body as well. We communicate with our body language. I mean, my, use of my hands and so forth, or whatever it is, my facial inflections. I mean, that's part of the way that we relate to each other. And sometimes that can get lost. Not all the time. You can take the picture, you can take the video, you can post it, and so forth. But there's a way in which that can be lost. And so, to me, there's a kind of double-edged sword with the technologies. And then if we were to relate it to the say the war time context, and I have done a lot of thinking about this, just from an academic standpoint. On the one hand, the technology, the application of high technologies in warfare can make war perhaps less brutal, less brutalizing, or cause for lesser infliction of at least casualties on our side. And I'm just thinking here about drones, okay? You don't have to risk soldiers to go and make certain attacks. On the other hand, precisely because you don't risk soldiers' lives, you're more likely to use those technologies, and you're more likely then to hit the wrong target, which we've done a lot. So again, it says you can be more precise, but because you're more precise, you might use it more, and it's kind of this double-edged nature of technology, I think. So that's a very, very good question. Very good question.
Well, that's a good answer too. But the technology really is neutral. It's a matter of who's using it and for what purpose. And,
right.
And
right.
You can have flash bombs or whatever it is, people on the internet for a moral purpose, an immoral purpose, or an entertainment purpose, whatever it is. And the same thing is true of talking about the lynch mob or the tyranny of the majority. The majority of people are getting their news and their information out of these sources. What are they saying? Who's controlling it? Nobody's controlling it, or everybody's controlling it. And you still have to, what's the relationship back to the moral standpoint of the individual and the society?
Right.
And how can you use technology to improve it, or improve morals, or
Yeah.
anything else?
Yeah, wonderful question. I guess just a very short response to that. I mean, one of the really profound moral tales, although again, it wasn't intended as a moral tale, but is a book by Aldous Huxley that you can take up on its 100th anniversary when you're as part of the Yachats Commons, about 18 years. But his book, Brave New World, trying to think about the impact of technologies. And for Huxley, as you rightly point out, technology has this value-neutral aspect, and the issues that we needed to think through as a community. He was worried about all sorts of technologies at the time, but who's in control of the technology? Certain elites control military technologies. Cell phones provide a democratization of technology. I mean, 80% of the world's population now has access to a cell phone. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So there's a democracy. But anyway, that's one question, one moral question you need to answer. Who controls the technology? And then second, for what purposes is the technology used for? And as you rightly point out, there can be some very important educational pieces on the internet, and there can be the worst of degrading humanity on the internet as well. So those would be sort of the two basic questions I think you'd start with.
I think this has been a great evening and a good way to tie the whole series together for To Kill a Mockingbird. And I'm sure Dr. Campbell will stay around for a few moments if you have some private moral issues you want to